She knocked on the wrong door, but found the right shelter. The year was 1876, and the prairie stretched wide and unbroken, a sea of grass swaying beneath the fading glow of sunset. When the stagecoach rattled away, its wheels clattering before vanishing into the horizon, Hannah McBride stood alone at the dusty roadside. Her carpetbag, small and worn, was clutched so tightly to her chest that her knuckles turned white. The wind caught strands of her dark hair, pulling them free of the bonnet that had sheltered her through long miles of travel. She had come expecting welcome. For months, her hope had been strung together by letters, words from a man who promised her a home, a family, and a chance to belong. But when she stepped down from the coach and glanced at the nearest ranch sign, her stomach twisted. The name carved there did not match the one written on the envelopes folded in her bag. The truth hit sharp and merciless. This was the wrong place. The driver had already departed, a trail of dust fading fast. She whispered into the wind, her voice almost breaking, "I have nowhere else to go." The gust carried her words as if the plains themselves were mocking her helplessness. She turned toward the ranch, a silhouette of weathered wood against the streaked sky. Smoke curled from the chimney, a thin line that promised warmth. She hesitated. To knock on a stranger's door was to risk rejection, but the sun was falling fast and the air had the bite of early spring. Finally, with steps that felt heavier than stone, she approached. Her knock sounded louder than she intended, a hollow thud that made her heart race. The door creaked open, and she found herself staring at Samuel Hart. He was taller than any man she had known, his frame broad and strong from years of work. His face bore the sun's mark, lined and rugged, but his blue eyes were sharp and steady. For a long moment, he said nothing. His gaze swept over her dust-stained dress, worn shoes, trembling grip on the bag. The silence stretched until she nearly shrank under its weight. At last, she forced words past the lump in her throat. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought this was another ranch, but I have nowhere else to go." His expression did not change, though something flickered briefly in his eyes, understanding, perhaps, or hesitation. Then, with a voice roughened by disuse, he stepped aside. "Come inside. It's cold." The warmth of the cabin washed over her instantly. The scent of wood smoke, leather, and earth filled the air. She perched on the chair he motioned to, clutching her bag on her lap as if it were a shield. Samuel moved with quiet assurance, setting a kettle on the stove, pouring water with practiced care. His silence felt deliberate, as though he spoke in actions instead of words. He placed a mug of steaming coffee in front of her, black and strong, and set down a piece of bread. Hunger pulled at her fiercely, though shame heated her cheeks. She ate slowly, the bitter coffee grounding her as much as the fire's warmth. When she finished, his voice cut through the quiet. "Name." "Hannah McBride," she said, her tone soft but steady. He nodded, once a gaze lowering back to the fire. The silence that followed was not empty, but weighted with things neither dared to say. She wanted to tell him the truth, that she was a mail-order bride meant for another man, that she had been left behind before she ever arrived. But the words stuck. For now, it was enough that he had not turned her away. After a long while, Samuel rose, pulled a quilt from a chest, and spread it carefully across a narrow cot in the corner. His hands were rough, his movements precise. "You can rest there," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we'll see what can be done." Hannah murmured her thanks, her voice catching on the word. She lay down on the cot, the scent of wool and cedar surrounding her. The fire crackled shadows flickering across the cabin walls. Outside, the prairie wind rattled the shutters, a reminder of the loneliness she had carried across miles of barren land. Yet inside there was silence of a different kind. Not the silence of abandonment, but of a man who guarded his world carefully. As sleep finally claimed her, Hannah wondered why a man so strong, so capable, lived alone in a home that felt warm, yet undeniably hollow. The morning light slipped through the cabin window, thin and pale as Hannah stirred beneath the quilt. The scent of coffee drifted toward her, and she sat up to see Samuel already at the stove. His movements were deliberate, quiet, the gestures of a man used to solitude. When she offered to help, he glanced at her briefly, then nodded toward the door. "Well's out back. Bring in water." The bucket felt heavy in her hand as she stepped into the cool dawn. The prairie stretched wide and hushed, but it didn't take long before she realized she was being watched. Along the road, Clara Benson appeared, her bonnet angled just so her eyes sharp as a hawk's. She slowed when she saw Hannah tugging at the well rope. "Didn't waste any time, did you?" Clara called, her voice carrying too easily on the still air. Already under Hart's roof, some women know how to land soft. Heat burned Hannah's cheeks. She gripped the bucket tighter, refusing to answer. But Clara's words had already done their work by the time Hannah returned to the cabin. A farmer leading his mule had slowed just enough to glance her way, his expression full of judgment. Inside, Samuel took the bucket from her without a word and carried it to the counter. His silence seemed deliberate, a kind of shield against the gossip he surely knew was already circling. For a moment, Hannah understood something unspoken about him. He would not argue with neighbors or defend himself with words. His defiance was measured in silence, not noise. As the days passed, Hannah found herself woven slowly into the rhythm of the ranch. She swept the cabin, mended a torn hem, fed the chickens. By evening, she was kneeling in the dust with one of Samuel's horses, coaxing the animal to eat oats from her palm. The mare's breath was warm against her skin, and the gentle nudge of its muzzle filled her with a strange, forgotten trust. Samuel watched from a distance, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Yet there was no mockery in his gaze, only steady observation, as if he were still deciding what fate had brought to his doorstep. That night, the weight of her secret became unbearable. The fire popped and crackled, and she stared at the flames, hands folded in her lap. "I wasn't meant to come here," she said at last, her voice trembling. "There was a man, letters, promises, vows, written in ink. But when I arrived, he wasn't there, and the coach left me at the wrong ranch. I had no one waiting." Her throat tightened. "No one wants a woman abandoned before she even arrives. No one wants the shame I carry." The silence that followed was heavy, stretching across the cabin like a thick blanket. Samuel's jaw worked as he stared into the fire. She braced herself for rejection, for him to tell her she could stay the night and leave at dawn. Instead, he placed another log into the flames, sparks flying upward, and finally spoke. "If you've told me your secret," he said, his voice low, "then it's only fair you know mine." Hannah looked up, startled. His face was half-shadowed, the firelight carving deep lines into his features. He drew a slow breath. "I can't have children." The words landed with the force of a hammer, stark and unembellished. Doctors' prayers, remedies, it never mattered. This ranch was meant for sons, for heirs. But mine will end with me. The town knows it. They whisper. Some call me half a man. His eyes lifted to hers, then steady and unflinching. In them she saw not weakness, but a raw wound carefully hidden beneath years of silence. Her lips parted, but at first no sound came. At last she whispered, "And yet you stand taller than any man I've met." Something shifted in his gaze, though he gave no outward sign. He only nodded once, and the fire crackled on. The silence that followed was no longer cold or distant. It carried weight, but also understanding a bond forming in the spaces between their words. From that evening on, their days moved in quiet rhythm. Hannah rose early to sweep the cabin, fetch water, and gather eggs. Samuel worked the ranch, his presence steady but never intrusive. They shared meals in companionable silence, the scrape of chairs and the creak of doors filling what once had been an emptiness. Slowly, Hannah began to sense that Samuel's silence was not absence. It was strength, a way of offering space without judgment. Yet the outside world was not so kind. At the mercantile, Hannah kept her chin lowered as she weighed flour and beans. Behind her, voices murmured, "That's her staying at Hart's place." Another voice sharper, "He's a fool. Can't give him children, can't give him pride. They'll both drown in shame." Hannah's hands remained steady, but inside she felt herself cracking. On Sunday, she walked beside Samuel to the church. The bell tolled across the plains, echoing like a summons. As they climbed the steps, conversation stilled. Clara's voice cut through the hush. "There they are, the stray and the barren man. A fine pair." Laughter rippled from a few gathered near the door. Hannah's face burned hot. She tried to step back to save him from further disgrace, but Samuel reached for her hand. He clasped it firmly, publicly, his gaze fixed forward. Gasps rose, whispers tumbled, but his grip remained steady. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. That night, as rain tapped against the roof, Hannah sat by the fire, tears blurring her vision. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "They'll only hate you more." Samuel looked at her face, half in shadow, half in flame. "Let them," he said. "I've lived with their whispers long enough. Another won't break me." In that moment, she felt something she hadn't known since she left home, safety, belonging, and a fragile kind of hope. The days slipped into a rhythm neither Hannah nor Samuel had expected. She swept the cabin, prepared meals, and tended the animals while he worked the larger demands of the ranch. At first, their words were few, short nods, practical instructions, but gradually silence grew into something steadier, almost companionable. The scrape of a chair across the floor, the creak of a barn door at dusk, the soft clatter of dishes became a language of its own. Hannah found herself surprised at the dignity in work she once thought beneath her. Her skirts brushed through dust and hay as she carried water. Her hands grew raw from scrubbing, yet the exhaustion at the end of each day was not shameful. It was grounding. She was building something, even if only small pieces of order in Samuel Hart's solitary world. Still, the town would not let her forget she was an outsider. When she walked into the mercantile, conversations hushed. Men glanced at her, and then away. Women tightened their grips on their children's hands. Some muttered that she was already angling for Hart's land. Others whispered crueler things, that she was trouble astray with no pride. The words gnawed at her, yet Samuel's presence steadied her. He never offered false comfort or reassurances, but when he walked beside her, his silent strength wrapped around her like armor. At church, he kept her hand firmly in his gaze daring anyone to speak against them. It wasn't romance as she once imagined it, but something deeper, a quiet alliance against the weight of scorn. One evening, a storm rolled across the plains. The sky darkened in shades of steel, and wind whipped through the grass until it bent low. By nightfall, thunder cracked so loudly that the windows rattled in their frames. The horses in the barn cried out, hooves pounding in panic. Samuel was already pulling on his coat when Hannah appeared at his side. "I'm coming," she said quickly, gripping a lantern before he could protest. Rain lashed their faces the moment they stepped outside, mud sucking at their boots as they rushed to the barn. The horses reared and stamped, eyes wide with terror as lightning split the sky. Hannah held the lantern high, her skirts plastered to her legs, while Samuel moved among the animals with calm authority. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice low and steady, as he pressed a hand to a stallion's flank. The horse shuddered wild-eyed, and Samuel leaned his weight into the animal until it stilled. Hannah, trembling but determined, copied his movements with another horse, murmuring soft words she scarcely knew she possessed. Their hands brushed once as they reached for a halter. Rain dripped from Samuel's hair, his eyes blazing with fierce calm, even as thunder boomed above them. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked, and the storm seemed to vanish into silence. It was not a moment of romance, but of survival, of trust earned through fire and fear. When at last the storm eased, they stood soaked and shivering in the barn's doorway, breathless with exhaustion. The lantern flickered between them, casting a golden light over mud-streaked faces. Neither spoke, yet both knew something had shifted. They had fought side by side, and in that struggle a bond had been forged stronger than words could carry. But peace never lasted long. A week later, Hannah felt the sting of gossip sharper than ever. At the Mercantile, Clara Benson's voice rang out loud enough for every ear in the store. There she is, the girl who wandered into Hart's house and never left. Already playing wife, isn't she? Laughter followed bitter and thin. Hannah kept her chin lowered, focusing on the sack of flour in her hands. But the ache of humiliation burned deep her shoulders, stiff with the effort of pretending not to hear. That Sunday, as they stood again at the church steps, the whispers seemed louder, the stares heavier. The stray and the barren man, someone muttered near the doorway. A ripple of chuckles followed. Hannah flinched, ready to pull away, but Samuel's grip on her hand tightened. His silence was thunder. He did not look left or right, did not bow his head. His broad frame and steady gaze carried her past the crowd as if daring them to speak again. For the first time in her life, Hannah felt what it meant to be defended not by words, but by presence. That night, the rain tapped softly against the roof, a gentler echo of the storm they had endured together. Hannah sat by the fire, her eyes shining with both gratitude and fear. She turned to Samuel, voice trembling. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. "They'll only hate you more for standing with me." He looked at her from across the flames, his face half in shadow. "Let them," he answered simply. "I've lived with their whispers long enough. Another won't break me." Tears stung her eyes as she lowered her gaze. She wanted to tell him how much his strength meant, how deeply it healed wounds she thought would never close. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she whispered, "I'm afraid I'll ruin you." Samuel's silence stretched steady as the land itself. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "You've given me something they can't take away. Someone who sees me not what I lack." The fire crackled rain, tapping the windows like a hymn. Hannah turned her face toward the warmth, her heart swelling with a fragile, unspoken hope. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she no longer felt like a stray. She felt instead like someone who might finally have a place to belong. The prairie had begun to soften into spring. Wildflowers dotted the grass, and the mornings carried a freshness that seemed to whisper of new beginnings. Hannah woke earlier now, her body attuned to the rhythm of the ranch. She baked bread in the mornings, worked in the barn during the day, and by evening her skirts were streaked with dust, her hands raw but steady. Though Samuel never asked her to stay, he also never hinted she should leave. Their silences, once tense, had grown warm and familiar, like a bridge slowly built across an impossible gulf. But the town's eyes remained sharp. At the mercantile, whispers prickled her back. At church, murmurs followed her like a shadow. She held her head high, but inside shame gnawed like a restless animal. One afternoon, as she swept the cabin floor, the sound of hooves echoed across the yard. Hannah glanced up to see a rider dismounting a tall man in a weathered coat, his hat pulled low. Sheriff Wade Carson. His face was grave as he swung down from the saddle, holding a letter folded tight in his hand. Samuel stepped from the barn, wiping his palms on a rag. The sheriff's eyes moved from him to Hannah, then back again. His voice carried the weight of something heavier than small-town gossip. "Hannah," he said slowly, "I've received a complaint from your first intended. Claims you misled him. Says you abandoned your arrangement to ensnare Samuel instead. Folks are beginning to whisper about fraud scandal." The words struck like a hammer. Hannah's breath caught her broom slipping from her fingers. She shook her head, stumbling forward. "No, that's not true. I never meant Samuel. I swear I never meant to." Her voice broke, splintering under the weight of despair. Shame rose up suffocating, dragging her back into the pit she thought she had left behind. She turned toward Samuel, panic in her eyes. "I should go," she whispered. "I'll only destroy what's yours." The sheriff's presence felt like judgment itself, heavy and inescapable. But Samuel did not move aside. Instead, he stepped forward, placing himself between Hannah and the lawman. His frame seemed larger, his voice steady as thunder when he spoke. "No," he said firmly, "you'll not go anywhere." The sheriff frowned. "Samuel, I have to take this seriously. If what he says is true, there could be trouble. The town's already circling with talk." Samuel's jaw tightened. "This woman is under my roof. She is under my name. Whatever past she carries, I accept it as my own. She is mine, and I am hers." The words rang through the air, sharp and undeniable. Hannah gasped, tears spilling down her cheeks. She had never been claimed with such certainty, never been defended with such strength. The sheriff's eyes softened his weathered face, betraying the faintest flicker of respect. He folded the letter slowly, tucking it into his coat. "If that's how it stands," he said quietly, "then that settles it." He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving silence in his wake. The only sound was the creak of leather and the fading thud of hooves. Hannah stood frozen, her hands pressed to her chest. She turned to Samuel, her voice trembling. "You meant it, even knowing everything." His gaze was steady, his face half in shadow beneath the brim of his hat. "Hannah," he said her name like a vow, "I have carried shame alone long enough. If I must carry it still, I would rather it be beside someone who makes the weight worth bearing." Her tears flowed freely, now the flood of emotion breaking through years of rejection and loneliness. She wanted to answer, to tell him what it meant to be chosen at last, but her voice failed. Only a sob escaped raw and unguarded. Samuel stepped closer. Then, not with haste, but with the slow gravity of a man who understood silence better than words. He lifted her hand, calloused fingers brushing against her skin, and pressed his lips gently to her knuckles. The gesture broke her. It was not pity, not obligation. It was love, quiet and fierce, forged in defiance of every whisper and every cruel judgment. That night, rain pattered against the roof, steady and soft. Hannah sat by the fire, her eyes reflecting the flames, her heart still trembling with fear and wonder. Samuel sat across from her, his face unreadable, yet his presence was steady as stone. "You shouldn't have risked yourself for me," she said finally, her voice small. His answer came after a long pause, his tone as steady as the fire. "I didn't risk anything. I chose. The words settled deep in her chest, heavier than promises written on paper, truer than vows whispered in secret. For the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, Hannah felt not only safe, but wanted. Outside, the rain sang its quiet hymn across the land. Inside, the fire burned steady and warm as two people sat together in silence that was no longer empty, but full of choice of belonging, of love, unspoken yet undeniable. Spring swept across the prairie with sudden force. Blossoms scattered across the fields carried by warm breezes that smelled of fresh grass and damp soil. Hannah rose each morning before the sun, her hands busy with bread dough, or sweeping her skirts brushing against barn doors as she followed Samuel into the rhythm of the ranch. The house, once hollow, began to carry the sound of footsteps and quiet conversation. But beyond their fences, gossip still clung like burrs. At the mercantile, voices dipped to whispers the moment Hannah entered. At church, Clara Benson's sharp tongue stung worse than ever. The stray and the barren man she declared one Sunday loud enough for half the town to hear. A ripple of laughter followed, thin and cruel. Hannah felt her cheeks burn as she tried to shrink into herself. Yet Samuel, unflinching, only tightened his hand around hers and walked forward with the same steady stride he always carried. His silence was stronger than argument, a quiet dare for anyone to challenge him. The turning point came not with a grand announcement, but with a simple decision. One morning, as the prairie air carried the promise of rain, Samuel spoke without preamble. "We'll marry tomorrow. Here, on this land." Hannah froze the broom in her hands, slipping to the floor. "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice trembling. His eyes met hers, steady and calm. "There's no sense in waiting. This is your home now, if you'll have it." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling before she could answer. Her nod was small, but it carried the weight of everything she had endured, the letters, the abandonment, the shame. Samuel bent his head, pressing his lips once more to her hand, sealing the vow before a word was spoken. The next day, under a sky streaked with sunlight and drifting clouds, the townsfolk gathered. Some came out of curiosity, others out of duty, and a few with softened eyes who had begun to see what lay between the pair. There was no church, no grand hall, only the open land stretching wide as a cathedral. Hannah wore a simple prairie dress, her dark hair loose, her cheeks flushed with nervous joy. Samuel stood tall beside her, his best coat pressed, his gaze fixed only on her. The preacher spoke words of union, steady and plain, but it was the silence between Samuel and Hannah that carried the true weight. When he took her hand before all and kissed it gently, the world seemed to hush. Even the prairie wind stilled as though it paused to honor their vow. Whispers lingered, of course. Clara Benson muttered under her breath, and a few men at the back shook their heads. But their voices dimmed against the sight of two people standing firm, forged not by perfection, but by endurance. After the vows, Hannah and Samuel returned to the ranch together. The house, once a hollow refuge, now felt like a home. The fire glowed warmer, the walls seemed sturdier, and every silence between them carried the promise of partnership. They moved side by side in the days that followed, mending fences, feeding livestock, preparing meals. Their bond was not marked by grand declarations, but by steady hands that did not let go. At night, when the prairie wind howled against the windows, Hannah no longer felt alone. She would sit by the fire with Samuel across from her, the two of them wrapped not in words, but in presence. Sometimes he would reach across the table, his hand finding hers in quiet reassurance. Sometimes she would lean against his shoulder, the simple weight of his strength enough to anchor her against every whisper of doubt. In time, the town grew quieter. People saw not a scandal, but a union that endured. Some neighbors softened, offering nods of respect at the mercantile or tipping their hats in passing. The cruelest tongues still wagged, but their words lost power against the evidence of lives lived with dignity. Hannah had once believed her worth depended on another man's promises, written in letters that vanished like smoke. But now she knew the truth worth was found in the steadiness of someone who chose her, not despite her past, but alongside it. Samuel Long, haunted by whispers of his own, had found in her not pity, but recognition, a partner who saw him fully without judgment. Their love was not thunderous or adorned with spectacle. It was quiet, resilient, and strong as the land they worked. It grew in shared labor and storms endured side by side in the silences that spoke louder than any words. As seasons turned, the prairie ranch became more than a refuge. It became a testament to the lesson both of them had lived, that love is not measured in perfection or approval, but in the refusal to let go when the world tries to tear you apart. For those who watched their story unfold, one truth lingered like blossoms carried on the wind. Love is not thunder or grand fanfare. It is the steady hand that holds firm when storms rage. It is the courage to stand against whispers, the strength to choose someone not for what they bring, but for who they are. Hannah and Samuel's union was born of mistakes, shame, and silence. Yet it endured because they saw each other, not the judgments, not the scars, but the truth beneath. And in that recognition, they found redemption. If you carry burdens that make you feel unworthy, remember this: you're not defined by whispers or rejection. The right person will see beyond what the world condemns, and together you can build something stronger than gossip or shame. If their story touched you, share your thoughts below. And if you believe love is worth standing firm for, even when the world scorns it, subscribe to hear more stories that remind us of the quiet power of endurance.